There is a mountain in eastern Turkey known as Mount Ararat. It's a beautiful mountain, towering 17,000 feet above the Turkish frontier. It is also the mountain believed by many to hold one of mankind's greatest mysteries. For ever since man first began to write, it has been written that Mount Ararat was the landing place of Noah's Ark. The motion picture you are about to see will attempt to unravel this 5,000-year-old mystery. We'll try to determine if the story of Noah is true, and if the Ark, in fact, does rest on the slopes of Mount Ararat. In our search, we will examine the historical accuracy of the Bible. We will experience the story of Noah. We will investigate the possibilities of a worldwide flood. We will relive the many adventures of the expeditions that have scaled Mount Ararat looking for the Ark. And we will take part in a number of startling new discoveries. This may be the most incredible film you will ever see, but the facts that will be presented are true.
It is our belief that the rediscovery of Noah's Ark and the establishment of this fact scientifically would become the greatest archaeological discovery of all time.
The rediscovery of Noah's Ark will bring into serious doubt some of the most important assumptions of modern science.
Everyone would be shocked and startled and intrigued if Noah's Ark were found on Ararat.
If Noah's Ark is there, then it shows that the Bible, even to the very earliest chapters of Genesis, is not poetry or myth, but actual history.
Over 1.5 billion living people, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, know this story, Noah and the Ark. It's a story taught to us as children, enjoyed by people of all ages, a story so powerful and so moving that it has survived for 5,000 years and appears in almost every major culture. For over 4,900 years, the story of Noah had been generally accepted as fact. But during the last century, with the advent of an aggressive scientific inquiry, skeptics have come forth and labeled the story a dubious combination of fact and fancy. They have said that the story of Noah, as contained in the Bible, is nothing more than legend. So in our search for Noah's Ark, it seems we must first look at the section of the Bible where Noah's story is told. We must try to determine if the Bible is factual, if it is indeed an accurate history of earlier civilizations. Although some might think it presumptuous to have to prove the Bible, there are those who labor strenuously to do just that. They're historians, archaeologists, scholars. And almost every day now, something is discovered which sheds new light on the historical aspects of the Bible. Genesis mentions the building of the Tower of Babel, or Babylon, in a city that thrived as a capital of the world. Archaeologists have long struggled to find the fabled tower. They now believe they have located it. Indications of a large tower, a stepped pyramid called a ziggurat, have been found in the Mesopotamian valley near ancient Babylon. Historical records show that a king did indeed undertake construction of the tallest tower of his day, only to abandon it, leaving it unfinished for centuries. Chapter 10 of Genesis is known as the Table of Nations. It is a description of the known world and its grandsons and great-grandsons ruled where. In so doing, it accurately reflects the geopolitical state of the world at that time. For a long time, the Bible alluded to an empire that archaeologists could find no proof of, until finally in 1906, Hugo Winkler uncovered some tablets in central Turkey, confirming the existence of the Hittite Empire. Genesis had said it existed. Science confirmed it. The bulk of Genesis concerns the story of Abraham, the patriarch of the Jews. Abraham is said to have been born about 2000 BC in the city of Ur in Samaria. Abraham passed out of Ur into Canaan. Once again, archaeologists have found proof that here too, as suggested in Genesis, there was a thriving civilization. Abraham's tomb is in Hebron. Its existence confirms anew the drama of his life, the saga, as it was told in Genesis. One of the archaeologists who has spent 25 years working in the Middle East is Dr. Philip Hammond. We asked Dr. Hammond what he could tell us about the historical accuracy of the Bible.
All right, of course, archaeology doesn't aim to prove the Bible in the strictest sense. On the other hand, archaeologists from practically the beginning of Middle Eastern work have found that a great number of things that we discover archaeologically in actuality support the backgrounds of the biblical material as well. At Hebron, where we were digging some years ago, for example, we found that the site had been occupied for a very long period, and as we approached the biblical period proper, we discovered the main walls, which tied in very nicely with the biblical dating in a broad sense. A number of other sites, of course, have produced similar kinds of materials. We find at Jericho that the biblical materials tell us that the site was unoccupied for a certain period of time. It was taboo, and then reoccupied in the Iron Age, and we found that to be so at that particular point. So that very often the archaeological support for biblical stories, biblical backgrounds, is extremely strong.
Yes, as archaeologists probe deeper into the shifting sands of the Middle East, new proof is supplied for the historical accuracy of the Bible. We now have proof of such cities as Megiddo and Masada, cities mentioned in the Bible, but hidden for centuries beneath the stark beauty of the Holy Land. These are ruins resonant with the echoes of our faith and our heritage. Genesis, then, is a remarkable historical document. And it is in Genesis that we find the story of Noah. So the next step in our search for Noah's Ark will be an examination of the story of Noah according to the Bible. The story begins with God's dissatisfaction with the world he had created. The Bible tells us that God looked upon the world's corruption and violence, and because of man's sinful ways, he vowed to destroy the earth and all those in it. But there was one man living then that found grace in the eyes of God. This was Noah, a just man. His 3 sons and their wives lived in the land of Sheripak, a part of the Middle East now known as Iraq. We know very little about Noah. All we do know is from the book of Genesis. We are told that he and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were men of faith, and that they resisted all the sinfulness and corruption of their day. And while others indulged in wickedness, God spoke to Noah. God told Noah to build an ark of gopher wood, to prepare it as a home not only for his family, but for a male and female of every walking and flying creature on earth. Noah was told that there would be a great deluge, a flood that would engulf all living things. Only those on the ark would survive. His instructions were to build an ark 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits across, and 30 cubits high. He was told to place windows in the ark 1 cubit below the roof, and to build a door in the side. The ark was to have 3 levels, and the wood was to be coated with pitch. For years, Noah and his family struggled to build the ark. And during the construction, the townspeople would often gather to ridicule Noah. But Noah ignored the jeers of his neighbors, and finally the ark was finished. Then Noah set out as God told him, and collected 2 of every living creature, 1 male and 1 female. The animals came with Noah willingly. The Bible says that God communicated to the animals and told them of their impending doom. The animals knew that Noah was their friend. And as Noah continued the gathering of the animals, his family made ready for the long journey ahead. Cages were built, hay was stored, and foodstuffs were collected.
There you are. Come on.
Soon the animals were gathered and the supplies were ready. Noah and his family began the difficult task of loading the ark. Everyone helped, or tried to. The last of the supplies and animals loaded, Noah, his wife, his sons, and his sons' wives boarded the ark. But there was still no sign of rain, and the townspeople mocked Noah. They laughed at the old man who had built a giant boat that had no rudder, no oars, no sails. Days passed, and there was still no sign of rain. The crowd of townspeople was growing, and they began to speculate how long Noah would stay cooped up in his ark before abandoning his belief in a flood. For 7 days and 7 nights, Noah and his family lived in the ark, waiting for the rains to start.
We'll have the prayer.
thunder.
The rain began. It fell gently at first, and the townspeople laughed.
Noah, here's your flood.
But as thunder and lightning exploded in the sky and the rain began to pour from the heavens, the townspeople realized they'd never experienced that kind of storm before. Noah and his family could hear the townspeople beating on the ark, but God's instructions were clear. Regretfully, Noah closed the window. That night, 5,000 years ago, the rain came down in mighty torrents from the sky, and the subterranean waters burst forth upon the earth. The rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Increased until even the highest mountain peaks were under 23 feet of water. All that lived and moved on the earth perished in the great flood. All perished except those that were lifted above the waters in the ark. His cargo were buffeted by rain, high winds, and tossed by the waters of the deluge. And as they went about their daily chores of caring for the animals, they didn't know if the floodwater would ever recede. On the 40th day, the rain finally stopped, and life continued on the Ark.
Want to help? sunlight. Mother! Father!
What is it, daughter?
Look.
Sunlight.
It stopped raining.
Now we can leave the ark.
Oh, now we must be patient. The Lord hasn't revealed how soon we can walk the earth again.
Twice, Noah sent a dove from the ark, hoping that it would find dry land and vegetation in the valleys below.
If there's land, he'll find it.
The first time, the dove returned to the ark having found no place to rest.
There he is.
But the second time, the dove returned to the ark with an olive branch in its mouth. Noah had been on the ark for 5 months, floating atop the flood, before it came to rest on Mount Ararat. In the 8th month, other mountain peaks became visible.
Morning, children.
Father. Careful going up that ladder.
In the 9th month, Noah made a hole in the ceiling of the ark so that he could walk on the roof and look down on the mountain. Nearly 3 more months passed before Noah felt it was safe enough to leave the ark. They had been on the ark for 375 days. Living creatures on the ark descended the slopes of Mount Ararat to repopulate the world. Noah built an altar to God, and for Noah's faithfulness, the Lord promised never to bring such destruction again. The story of Noah, according to the Bible, is it true? Could the ark have been built so that it would stay afloat for 13 months? Would it have been big enough to carry all those animals? Was the earth actually covered with water? And finally, since the wood of the ark was soaked with pitch, wouldn't there be some evidence still in existence in the area known as Ararat? Well, those are valid questions. And in the search for Noah's ark, they are the questions that must be examined. We can start here in this geology lab as we examine the evidence for the historic possibilities of a universal flood. A global flood would have had to deposit huge amounts of sedimentation throughout the world. It has been estimated that over 75% of the surface of the globe is sedimentary in nature. The United States has immense sedimentary deposits located in California, the Colorado Plateau, and the Midwest Plains. But India has the deepest known sedimentary deposits, 60,000 feet deep. Geologists have found scores of sedimentary deposits throughout the world where fossilized remains of animals and plants, oftentimes from different geographical regions, were dumped into one huge graveyard. Unusual transportation and rapid burial are usually indications of a flood. A fossil graveyard, which is today a tourist attraction in Lincoln, Wyoming, is another example of a deposit containing a variety of odd remains. Alligators, palm leaves, birds, deep-sea fish, turtles, mammals, and many types of insects. Probably one of the greatest finds indicating a universal flood are the lignite deposits in Germany, where scientists have determined that a mixture of plants, animals, and even insects from all climatic areas of the world are buried in one common mass grave. In 1929, the leading English archaeologist, Sir Leonard Woolley, confirmed that such a flood did occur in the valley of the Tigris-Euphrates, known by scientists to be the birthplace of civilization. During an excavation at Abraham's city of Ur, Woolley discovered that beneath the layers of successive civilizations, there was about 11 feet of mud. Mud without any trace of human presence. Then, beneath this layer of mud, Woolley found traces of another civilization. Ruins of human dwellings, the presence of life. This discovery proves that for a time in this area, life was absent and floodwaters were present. Further proof of such a deluge is confirmed by these and other fossilized objects, all found atop the world's highest mountain, Mount Everest. Also, geologists who have climbed Mount Ararat have discovered salt clusters. Analysis of these salt clusters showed them to be from salt water, proof that the mountain was once covered with seawater. Yes, throughout the world, evidence for a flood is abundant. There seems no doubt that at one time the earth was engulfed in a great deluge. But what could have caused such a catastrophic worldwide flood? What happened to the earth 5,000 years ago that could have caused even the highest mountains to be covered with water? To find the answer, I've come here to this observatory to talk to Roger Rusk, Professor Emeritus of Physics at the University of Tennessee. In our research, we asked many scientists what could have started such a flood. A number mentioned a shift in the Earth's orbital axis. We asked about this possibility.
See you again.
We've been investigating the possibility of a universal deluge. And as a part of our investigations, a question has come up about a possible shift on the axis of the entire Earth. Is that within scientific possibility?
Yes. George Dodwell in Australia has come up with a theory that the Earth used to be at a 90-degree angle to its path around the sun and had a dislocation of some sort that carried over to about 26 degrees and has come back to the present 23.5 in a stable position.
Well, now, wouldn't a shift of that kind be a terribly violent kind of thing? What could cause it?
Well, there are various things that could cause it, various agents. A big comet hitting the Earth would be one. An asteroid hitting the Earth could be one.
Well, now, if indeed there were such a change, such a shift, what would be the immediate result on the surface of the Earth? Would it bring about the conditions, let's say, of a universal deluge? Would it move the oceans and generally just disrupt the entire landmass?
This idea was expressed at an international meeting of petroleum geologists some years ago. The idea was expressed that a crustal adjustment like that, and if the mantle moves, the core will have to move in the opposite direction because the total spin cannot change. That would be quite slow, whereas the response of the oceans would be instantaneous, and the ocean would be sloshed out of the basins and just wash over the continents and go back down to the ocean basin on the other side.
You mean an entire ocean would simply get up and wash across a landmass, just wiping out everything in its path, and then gradually seep back into the basin?
Yes, that's perfectly plausible.
Well, Professor, wouldn't the shift of the mantle in this manner bring about a violent volcanic action?
Oh, yes, tremendous volcanic action. And this could trigger, of course, tremendous precipitation. You see, the Earth at that time, so long ago, probably had a canopy around it, just as Venus and Jupiter and Saturn now have. Perfectly normal state of affairs.
Canopy? You mean of clouds?
A complete covering of clouds, made up of water vapor and water droplets and ice crystals in the top, you see, such as our cirrus clouds today are ice crystals. And if we had volcanic activity stir up a lot of this dust, then you'd get the condensation, you see, of moisture around these dust particles, be nuclei, and this whole canopy could be precipitated out very, very quickly.
Well, then, If we did have, indeed, this dislocation, the volcanic action, the movement of the ocean, the breaking up of the canopy over the earth, the change, in effect, in everything that took place, this would certainly match, more or less, the account of a universal deluge which destroyed virtually all life.
Yes.
How long ago, then, would the theory, according to the theory, would this have been?
Something of the order of 5,000 to 6,000 years ago.
Then it does approximately match the story of Genesis.
It fits very well. Fits very well with our idea of the time period between the, say, Abraham going backwards to the time of Noah. Fits very well with that.
Now, that's impressive evidence. Both geologically and archaeologically, all indications seem to point to a universal deluge. But ancient man left other traces of his early days. Records like the Bible and the Egyptian cuneiform tablets tell us a great deal about major events of the past. Since we've already determined that the Bible is archaeologically accurate, let's see if the historical documents of other ancient civilizations also support the theory of a great flood. There are over 200 other cultural accounts of such an event, and in each case the flood was brought about by a supreme being. A man was told to build an ark to save himself, his family, and 2 of every living creature. The ark floated and finally came to rest atop a mountain. The early Greeks believed that they were the second breed of man, that the first had perished in a great deluge. One man, Deucalion, as pure in spirit as Noah, was warned to build an ark and to save his wife and children and to prepare the ark for 2 of each of the animals. They escaped the flood and survived, according to the Greek legend, to begin a new life atop a mountain. In the late 1850s, British archaeologists, led by George Smith, discovered these cuneiform clay tablets when they unearthed the library of King Ashurbanipal. 3 of the tablets told a story they already knew, the story of Noah and the ark. In America, there are nearly 40 different Indian deluge accounts. The Navajo Indians believed that the Grand Canyon was a result of the Great Deluge Flood. Other Indian tribes believe that the flood was caused by the wrath of the underworld water monsters. The story goes on to explain how an Indian was saved from the flood by a raft the hero had built, and that the hero had taken animals aboard the raft with him. The raft came to rest on a mountain peak after the floodwaters receded. The Indians believed all of the various flood accounts long before being exposed to Europeans and their Christian concepts of the flood. The fact that there was a great flood and a man who survived it is recorded history. But whether Noah and his live cargo survived the flood as passengers aboard an ark has yet to be proven. Archaeologists agree that if the ark did navigate the waters of the deluge, its existence can be proven by finding some ancient artifact from it. A piece of the so-called gopher wood of which it was built, a pot or a tool, something to prove that Noah and his family existed and indeed dwelled aboard such a vessel. But to find such proof, one must know where to look. One must know where the ark came to rest when the waters receded. One must locate the mountains of Ararat, referred to in the book of Genesis. Here in eastern Turkey, because of local legends, this beautiful primitive mountain is called the Mountain of Evil by the Kurds, the Mountain of Pain by the Turks, and the Mother of the World by the Armenians. We know it as Ararat, the landing place of Noah and his ark. Located on the border separating Turkey from the Soviet Union, both history and local legends support the Bible story that the ark landed here, on Mount Ararat. The Turks call Mount Ararat Arida, meaning Mountain of the Ark. And the Persians call it Kokinu, meaning Mountain of Noah. And there is hardly a place near Mount Ararat whose name does not recall Noah's story. In Yerevan, a city that seems to have leaped from the pages of the Arabian Nights, scholars contend this is the location where Noah made his first home. Yerevan translates to mean the first appearance. Here at the base of the Ahora Gorge is the rebuilt part of the ancient town of Ahora, which had been completely destroyed by an earthquake in 1840. Aruri, another name for Ahora, means the planting of vine. According to historians, European vine growing originated from this area, where Noah, according to the Bible, planted a vineyard. And in the towns and villages surrounding Mount Ararat, the local people, known as the Kurds, believe that Noah's Ark rests on the mountain. The Kurds also believe the mountain is evil, and they rarely ever attempt to climb it. Ararat is a volcanic mountain, nearly 17,000 feet high, with its summit permanently covered with glacial ice and snow. Seldom is the summit even visible. Misty fog like clouds not only cover the peak, but create blizzard conditions most of the year. At lower elevations, thunderstorms are prevalent. Oftentimes, the sound of thunder is not thunder at all, but a chain reaction of echoes created as the wind sends gigantic boulders crashing down the Ararat slopes. Recent accounts exist of climbers being killed by these boulders, which they could hear but not see as they stood in the misty, fog-like atmosphere. Other treacherous aspects of the mountain are the total lack of trees anywhere for shelter or campfires, the lack of water because melting snow is quickly absorbed through the porous rocks into underground streams, and at snow-covered elevations, 100-foot deep crevasses, often not noticed until tragedy strikes. The mountain is home to some of nature's most unfriendly creatures, man-attacking wolf dogs and poisonous snakes. Mount Ararat is covered with loose, porous rock, and for every 3 steps a climber takes, he usually slips back 2. Probably the most dangerous aspect of the mountain is the misfortune of climbers setting off huge snow and rock avalanches merely by talking to each other. One of the men to actually climb Mount Ararat is John Morris. We asked him to tell us about some of the hazards he encountered firsthand.
One of the most difficult things is in the area of weather. Mount Ararat is the only glacial-covered mountain in the entire region, so any of the evaporation that evaporates from the floor of the mountain does condense up on the mountain at about 2 or 3 o'clock every day. Usually in the morning, if there's no weather front in the area, the mountain is just crystal clear. It's a beautiful sight. But then along about 10 o'clock, the haze sets in, and before long, at 2 or 3 o'clock, almost every day, there's a storm up on Mount Ararat, and usually this is a thunderstorm with thunder and lightning. In fact, probably the worst thing that happened to us up on the mountain, one time 3 of us were climbing at about 14,000 feet up on the mountain, and got caught in one of these blizzards that turned into an electrical storm, and before that was over, the 3 of us that were climbing that day were actually struck by lightning. I realize most people, when they get struck by lightning, they don't do a whole lot of talking about it afterwards. In fact, for a while there, I didn't think we were going to be doing any talking about it. 2 of us, myself and 1 other man, were totally paralyzed from the waist down for hours, just lying there in the snow. The 3rd man had amnesia, in shock, just walking around, bumping into rocks. Really, he didn't know who he was or where he was. He really didn't know you couldn't walk right through a rock. He didn't know anything. Well, I make no apology for the fact that I'm a Christian. I do believe in God, and I am convinced that God reached down that day and worked a miracle to allow us to recuperate from our injuries and continue the search for the Ark.
Yet, in spite of the hazards of the mountain and the superstitions of the local people, history is full of men who have climbed Mount Ararat and seen the Ark. Accounts from 700 years before the birth of Christ relate to the experience of pilgrims climbing Ararat to scrape tar off the sacred vessel from which to fashion good luck omens. But the mountain often proved too hazardous for these ancient pilgrimages. Men seeking the Ark began to meet with grave misfortunes, some cataclysmic, so the pilgrimages ended. Berosus, the Babylonian high priest from the temple Bel Marduk, states that in his time, around 300 BC, remains of the Ark could still be seen, and some get pitch from the ship by scraping it off and use it for amulets. Hieronymus, Egyptian historian who authored the ancient history of Phoenicia about 30 BC, mentions the Ark. Also about 30 B.C., Nicholas of Damascus, the biographer of Herod the Great, tells of the Ark landing near the summit and that relics of timber were still there. In 380 A.D., Epiphanes, bishop of Salamis, visited the land of the Kurds and stated that he was shown wood from Noah's Ark. In the snow of Mount Ararat, wrote Armenian historian and world traveler Hyphon, one can see a black spot that is Noah's Ark, which he himself saw in 1254. Even Marco Polo, the renowned world traveler, wrote about Noah's Ark's presence on Mount Ararat in 1269 A.D. Early history notes many such sightings of the Ark. But it hasn't been until recently that most major expeditions have scaled the dangerous slopes of Ararat and brought back proof of the Ark's existence. The reason, apparently, is the glacier. Mount Ararat is covered with an icy, snow-packed glacier. And for long periods of time, the summers are not warm enough to permit a sufficient meltback for climbers to reach the summit. And because of this, it was not until 1829 that Ararat was again successfully climbed. The man who did it was a German physician, Dr. Friedrich Perot. He had heard of claims that at the Armenian monastery at Ekmiadzin, a cross said to be made from the sacred wood of Noah's vessel. Perot described the cross as being of a reddish-brown color, measuring about 12 inches by 9 and about an inch thick. After seeing the cross, he journeyed up Ararat to the 7,000-foot level. There he visited the St. Jacob Monastery. It was said that here were ancient Noahian relics and manuscripts. The monastery contained priceless remains of Noah's great voyage. Once he had finished in Ahura, Perot continued on and successfully reached the summit of the hazardous Mount Ararat, but never sighted the Ark. Then, just 11 years later, in 1840, there was a massive earthquake. Like the 2,000 villagers of Ahura, were covered with debris during the destruction in June 1840. No one survived. Immediately after the earthquake, which caused death and destruction to all villages surrounding Ararat, Turkish authorities sent several teams of workers up the mountain to build protective barriers against avalanches. One of these teams reported the discovery of the forepart of a very old ship jutting out of a glacier. The expedition reported seeing the Ark 14,000 feet up Mount Ararat. They reported seeing several stalls and cages in the exposed interior of the great vessel. The Turkish report stirred additional overseas interest among scientists of that period. Throughout the 1800s, they came, exploring, seeking, hoping to bring back physical proof of what the Turkish report said was really there. Hermann von Abik conquered the Ararat summit in 1845. Colonel Kadzko of the Russian Army reached the peak in 1850. And Englishman Major Robert Stewart made it in 1845. All of them encountering the freezing temperatures and suffering the effects of strenuous labor at high altitudes, battling blizzards and avalanches in the high, thin air. All of them encountered the superstitions of the local mountain people, the Kurds. Sometimes renegades among the Kurds preyed on the mountain parties, pillaging their camp, even murdering an occasional climber.
Put us up!
A strange and mysterious tale next emerged out of Ararat. A tale only pieced together some 70 years later. I asked Pastor Harold Williams of Shreveport, Louisiana, to fill in the details of this extraordinary drama. Pastor, when and where and how did you meet Haji Yerim?
It was the year 1915. I found old Haji Yerim in a pool of blood in his bed. Being in medical work, I took care of him until he recovered and then took him to our home at Pacific Union College, where we cared for him and he lived with us for several months. Near the close of that time, he told me the story of 3 atheists who came wanting to find Noah's Ark, but they pretended to be Christians. Well, they told such a nice story and seemed so sincere that finally they were believed, and they hired Haji Yerim's father as guide and Haji as assistant. So they took them up to the Ark. When they got inside the Ark, these 3 atheists revealed their true identity. They had claimed to be earnest Christians. Instead of that, they were atheists, hoping to prove there was no Ark up there. Well, they were so enraged that they took their hand axes first and started chopping, but they couldn't cut that wood. It was nearly as hard as rock. Then they started to kill these 2 men, their guides. Then the younger one of the 3 said, "Stop. How will we ever find our way back again?" So they cut themselves and exchanged blood and took a blood oath that if any one of the 3 ever revealed the truth, the other 2 would kill them. Then they told their guides that if they ever told anything about what had happened, that they would kill them, that they would keep tabs on them the rest of their days.
I understand, sir, that sometime later there was an Englishman who said that he'd been one of the people there.
Yes. That was when we were living in Brockton, Massachusetts, and I was teaching in the high schools. One morning, Mrs. Williams brought me a newspaper, and as I looked at it, I caught a little note down at the bottom of the page, and here it told about an Englishman who, on his deathbed, said he had to clear his conscience. And here he told the same story that Haji had told me several years before.
At that time, had you published Haji Yerim's story?
No, I had not.
Then there was no way the Englishman could have learned it.
Absolutely no way.
In 1876, a prestigious British statesman, jurist, and author, Sir James Bryce, made a dramatic and first time ever solo ascent of the mountain, and returned with a piece of evidence that seemingly should have shocked the scientific world into action. Braving the hostile environment of Ararat, Sir James uncovered and brought back to London a 4-foot-long, 5-inch thick piece of partially petrified hand-tool timber. He found the wood at 14,000 feet, where no trees had ever grown. And although newspaper headlines hailed the event, scientists scoffed at it. His discovery came when the theory of evolution was gaining in popularity, and most scientists of the time just chose not to believe him. Similar treatment was accorded a report issued by a Turkish commission in 1883. The commission, investigating avalanches on Mount Ararat, reported that they had seen Noah's Ark. Their report stated that they came upon a gigantic structure of very dark wood protruding from a glacier. It was in a good state of preservation. The Turkish government, irked by the disparaging treatment accorded this report by the world's newspapers and scientific leaders, did not follow up the discovery with another expedition. Despite this, 4 years later, another world traveler announced he would mount an expedition and attempt to locate the Ark.
Thank you, thank you.
His name was Prince John Joseph Nuri, the magnetic and astonishing Archbishop of Babylon. He began his ascent of the sacred mountain in 1887. On April 25th of that year, the prince realized his dream. He saw Noah's Ark. Prince Nuri reported that he found the Ark wedged in the rocks and half filled with snow and ice, that it was made of dark beams of very thick wood. His story further corroborated the 1883 Turkish newspaper account. Prince Nuri had hoped to return to Ararat to mount a major expedition. One of his proposals was to take the Ark to the Chicago Exhibition, the World's Fair of 1893. Nuri, however, was never able to gain financial support for this major expedition he longed to lead to Mount Ararat. The prince's secret, his route to the Ark on Mount Ararat, was lost forever when Nuri died unexpectedly from pneumonia. The next story to surface in the search for Noah's Ark took place in 1902, when as a boy, Armenian farmer Georgy Hagopian was taken to the Ark by his uncle. Illustrator Alfred Lee interviewed George Hagopian, and we asked him to recount the story to us.
George Hagopian was about 72 when I first met him in 1970. When he saw Noah's Ark, he was living in Turkey. He had been born at Lake Van, and he and his uncle would take their sheep and goats across to Mount Ararat every summer and graze their flocks on the mountain, as the Kurdish people do today. Every summer they go above the heat of the desert to graze the flocks in the meadows up there.
When they got to the Ark, George's uncle dropped his pack, and together they began to haul stones to the side of the ship. Within a short time, they had stacked a pile of rocks against the side of the Ark. Grabbing Georgie by the arm, his uncle said, "You are going on top of the Holy Ark." He put Georgie on his shoulders and said, "Grab the edge and pull yourself up." Georgie stood up straight on the roof and looked all over the ship. It was long. The height was almost 40 feet. There was a big black hole in the roof. He peeked into the blackness of the hole but saw nothing. Georgie then pulled a piece off the Ark. It was made of wood. The grain was visible. He didn't see any nails. It seemed the whole ship was petrified wood. He remembered the roof was flat, with the exception of a narrow raised section running all the way from the bow to the stern, with many holes in it. His uncle told him these were holes for air. Georgie told him he was afraid, so his uncle let him come down.
My desire as an illustrator was to draw a picture of Noah's Ark as authentically as possible. When I went out there, I told him that I was very keenly interested in his guiding me in illustrating what he had seen. It took 1.5 years. I'd go between Eastern Shore, Maryland. He lived in Easton, and I lived in Washington. I'd go back and forth, and I would work on these sketches. I'd go over the tapes and all the pages of notes and sketches that I had. Finally, after 1.5 years, I brought this picture out to him. He took the pen out of my hand and made these scratches right here. He said, "You neglected to put some rocks right here," as I remember it. But he said, "The rest of this, to the best of my memory, that's what Noah's Ark looked like."
This drawing by Lee was inspired by George's description and measurements of the Ark. It is perhaps a definitive portrait of the vessel God asked Noah to build. The next reported sighting of the Ark was in 1916, when 2 Russian aviators saw the remains of the Ark while flying over Mount Ararat. They spotted the Ark near a glacial pond and described it as a strange-looking vessel whose top was rounded over with a flat catwalk about 5 feet wide down the center of it. A report was sent to the Tsar, and on his orders, 2 special companies of soldiers were sent to the mountain. 2 weeks of hard labor were needed to reach the site. Once there, complete measurements were taken, plans were drawn, and even photos were taken. The Ark was found to contain hundreds of rooms. Some unusually large rooms had fences of great timbers across them. Other rooms were lined with cages. A report was sent back to Moscow, but only 2 days after it arrived, the government was overthrown by the communists, and the records were destroyed. Dr. John Warwick Montgomery met a man who was directly linked to publication of the story of the Russian aviators. We asked him about it.
The Russian expedition is one of the most interesting stories connected with the survival of the Ark. And what we know about this, the solid information, is dependent very largely on the gentleman whose picture you see here. This is the late Colonel Alexander Kur. He was a colonel in the White Russian Army. This man had contact with soldiers who were in the squad that went up Ararat and verified the existence of a boat, the boat that had been seen by an aviator. Colonel Kur mentions in a sworn statement that he knew a Lieutenant Ruzhansky, whose brother, a sergeant who had archaeological training, was actually a member of that squad. Colonel Kur also was responsible for the first publication of this information. I had contact with Colonel Kur myself a year or so before his death in Menlo Park, California. He was a most distinguished and pleasant gentleman, and I was quite certain that he was sure of his information, that he had not imagined this in any sense of the word.
The story of the Russian expedition served as confirmation of the George Hagopian sighting in 1902. Based on information gathered from these sightings, our next step in the search for Noah's Ark took us to Southern California. This is a marine laboratory set up to study the oceans and the ships that sail on them. We've come here to see if these scientists can tell us anything about the possible seaworthiness and navigability of Noah's Ark. But before we can do that, we must know the design and the approximate size of the Ark. This drawing, as you know, was made by Fred Lee after extensive interviews with George Hagopian. But throughout the ages, artists and historians have had different concepts of the Ark. Prismatic rhomboids, pregnant sampans, or simple great-hulled vessels. However they conceived the Ark, they knew the Ark must be large enough to hold 2 of all the animals of the world and be stable enough to sustain the violent seas of the Great Flood. Even though artists and historians have had many different ideas about what the Ark looked like, based on the eyewitness accounts of the Russian expedition and George Hagopian, together with information from the Bible, we believe this model is an accurate representation of Noah's Ark. Now, as to size, God's instructions to Noah were to build the Ark 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. A cubit in ancient days was a measurement of the distance from a man's elbow to his fingertips, anywhere from 18 to 22 inches. Using the smaller measurement, 18 inches, we can estimate that the Ark Noah built would have been 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. It resembled a long rectangular box, a rectangular box larger than 20 college basketball courts. It was the largest wooden ship ever built by a man in any age. Shipbuilders have discovered that the Ark's length to breadth equals a ratio of 6 to 1, meaning it would be a slow-moving vessel, but one of the most stable vessels ever built. So stable, in fact, that the U.S. battleship Oregon, built around the turn of the century, was designed with the exact same ratio. The Ark design ratio also means greater capacity, greater safety in operation, and always calls for a smaller crew. Dr. Henry Morris, a former professor of hydraulic engineering, has done a great deal of work in connection with the Ark of Noah. We spoke with him in his office. Dr. Morris, we've been studying the design of the Ark with an eye to its seaworthiness and its stability. And the question is very simply, would it have been a stable craft?
Yes, as far as we can calculate, it would in terms of the forces, the hydrodynamic forces involved, that this would be very stable. In fact, you can show that the balance between the buoyant force and the gravitational force and the wave force and so on would be such that the Ark would right itself if it were tilted anywhere up to 90 degrees, anywhere from 0 to 90 degrees, in other words. The righting effect would be such that it would just come right back up again. It would be practically impossible to capsize.
Using the information given to us by Dr. Morris, we took our model of the Ark and placed it in the test tank at the Marine Laboratory. When subjected to the irregular waves generally found on the ocean, the Ark was deemed not only seaworthy, but exceptionally stable. Then the test tank duplicated waves equivalent to 200-foot tidal waves, waves far larger than the Ark would have experienced during the flood. Again, the Ark was not only seaworthy, but extraordinarily stable. Like the giant ships of today, the Ark's low center of gravity gave it a tremendous stability. The deeper it sank into the water because of its heavy cargo, the more stable it became. It had no rudder, no sails, no oars. Remember, the Ark wasn't meant to go anyplace. It was simply meant to float, and float it did. Some 900 miles to Mount Ararat in 150 days, according to scholars who suspect that it was built that far away, on the banks of the Tigris River. The Ark had 3 decks. Ark scholars believe the top deck was occupied by Noah and his family and foodstuffs. The second deck was divided into rows of stalls and tiers of cages to keep the animals separated. The third, or bottom deck, was used for ballast and for the storage of wastes. What was the capacity of the Ark? One expert puts it this way. It could have carried more than 569 railroad freight cars, or up to 30,000 animals and birds, with lots of room left over for Noah. Probably nothing about the Noah's Ark account has caused so much curiosity as the animals themselves. How was it possible to gather representatives of every type? How many different kinds were aboard? What was the total number of animals on the Ark? And how did they care for the animals? For the answers, we can turn again to scientists and Bible scholars. According to these scholars, the actual gathering of the animals was not too difficult. The Bible says that God communicated to 2 of every kind of animal, just as he had communicated to Noah, and they came with Noah willingly. The animals, it is said, were given a premonition of the great flood to come, and they knew that Noah was their friend. How many animals did Noah load onto the Ark? No one can be sure. There's no way for us to know exactly how many species there were in Noah's day. But many scientists agree that the number would fall somewhere between 1,544 and 2,392. How did Noah and his family feed and take care of approximately 2,000 animals? Scientists have pointed out that with 2,000 animals aboard, it would mean that during a 12-hour day, each member of Noah's family would have to feed 1 animal every 3 minutes. In his book, The Genesis Flood, Dr. Morris examined the problem of caring for the animals. We asked him about it. How would 8 people feed and care for 2,000 animals for 13 months?
Of course, many people have raised that question as an objection to the whole story, that it would be just impossible to care for the many thousands of animals that might have been on the Ark. At least a reasonable possibility would be that these animals had the ability to hibernate, as many modern animals do. For example, the bear and many other animals can escape bad weather by the process of just suspending most of the bodily functions. Sort of a dormancy, state of suspended animation almost. So I just suppose that perhaps as the temperature began to get cold and the skies got dark and the noise of the thunder and the waves and so on outside, after the animals had once been installed in their cages and fed, but then they just sort of went to sleep for most of the time during the year. Now, of course, occasionally Noah and his family would have to feed them, but it wouldn't necessarily have been an overwhelming task for the 8 people on the Ark to take care of the animals when most of the time they were hibernating.
So based on all available evidence, we know that the eyewitness sightings of the Ark correspond with modern-day technical, scientific, and biological information. That the Ark and its live cargo were capable of surviving the Great Deluge. But people were still skeptical. Where is the proof, they asked? Where is the evidence that the Ark still rests on Mount Ararat, waiting in cold storage under 17.5 square miles of ice and moraine? They wanted physical proof that the Ark existed. They wanted a piece of the so-called gopher wood for examination. So the expeditions continued. This photograph of an Armenian monk was taken in 1933 by Los Angeles radio station KFI reporter Carveth Wells. He was sent to the Armenian monastery at Echmiadzin in Turkey to verify whether Dr. Perot had actually seen a cross made from the Ark's wood in 1829. What he saw was a cross, reddish in color, 12 inches long. It was the only known relic from Noah's Ark in existence at that time. In 1938, world-famous newspaperman and chronicler of the bizarre, Robert Ripley, joined the search for artifacts from Noah's Ark. Ripley, writer of the popular Believe It or Not series, with a readership of 80 million in 38 countries, had gained an impeccable reputation over 30 years for never having been proved wrong. In his worldwide expeditions to 198 countries, Ripley traveled to Borsippa in Iraq and found the famous Tower of Babel. While in Iran, Ripley noted that 1/4 of the area of Iran is a barren desert, which is cracked into odd-shaped polygons. He went on to explain that these cracks were caused when the waters of the Great Flood dried up. In Damascus, Ripley found what natives believed to be the tomb of Noah. The sick would often visit the tomb, hoping for miraculous cures. Later, during World War II, American flyers flew hundreds of flights over Mount Ararat, taking off from the Allied bases in Tunisia and going to Russia in a major attempt to keep the Red Army supplied. Several times during those years, reports surfaced saying that airmen had seen the Ark locked in the glacial mass below. One of these sightings was reported in a 1943 edition of the U.S. Army paper Stars and Stripes. Australian and Russian flyers also reportedly saw the great vessel, partially obscured, covered with ice and snow. After World War II, many Russian flights continued over Mount Ararat. Errol Cummings, Ark scholar, met Dr. Donald Liebman, a man who had first-hand knowledge of these Russian flights.
Well, Dr. Liebman and his wife came to our residence in Farmington, New Mexico. In Dr. Liebman's interviews with us, he strongly emphasized the fact that the squadron leader indicated they had had an expedition year after year from the years 1937 through 1947. And then again, another expedition in 1948. No question about it, as far as he was concerned. And in addition to that, of course, we know that they had an expedition in 1915 and 1916, a large expedition, and another expedition in 1918. So this makes, as far as we're concerned, 13 expeditions that the Russians have had to the Ark of Noah. He gave us quite an accurate account of his experience. He had met the officer of the USSR Air Force who had done the flying over a period of years from 1937 to 1947, 10 expeditions. And then he was shown, when Dr. Liebman met this man in Hamburg in 1947, he was shown 3 of the photos taken. And he had drawn a sketch for us of one of the photos that was presented to him by the platoon leader from the Russian USS Air Force. And this is that sketch. It shows the Ark at about 14,000 feet, more or less, with the prow of the ship showing about 80 feet of the prow showing. And the prow apparently is in a small cirque or small body of water, seated on a cliff. And incidentally, this sketch corresponds with many other stories that we have. This is the interesting thing. So that we feel that there's authenticity to all that Dr. Liebman had to say and to the story of the Russian flyers.
In 1952, an American pipeline engineer working in the Middle East similarly saw a portion of the Ark exposed on the face of Mount Ararat. George Jefferson Green was on a reconnaissance mission looking for oil sites, traveling in a helicopter when he saw the great ship protruding from the rocks with only one side exposed. Reaching for his camera, Green directed the helicopter pilot to maneuver the craft as close as possible to the huge structure below. Closer and closer they edged, while the excited engineer recorded his discovery on film. Sideways, head-on, from closer than 100 feet away, the shutter clicked, while the sun was beginning to lower in the western sky. Green took what turned out to be 6 extraordinary photographs, or so his friends say. For Green, who transferred to a mining operation in British Guyana, was murdered. All of his belongings, including the valuable photographs, disappeared. Traveling with only his 11-year-old son, Raphael, climbed Mount Ararat. The film you are seeing is actual footage of the expedition taken by Navarra and his son. As Navarra and Raphael worked their way up the lower slopes, Navarra thought back to his 2 previous attempts to find Noah's Ark. In 1952, he discovered an astonishing patch of blackness within the ice. The mass was sharply defined and looked like the ribs of a great ship. But he was alone. His Kurdish guides had deserted him below, and he had to leave the mountain. In 1953, Navarra returned to the mountain. He found his way fairly easily, climbing to within 100 yards of the timbers. But boulders, perched precariously above, rolled down at the sound of his voice. He was able to get about 20 yards closer when suddenly he felt faint. He couldn't coordinate his movement in a crevasse. Navarra gave his son the camera and began to lower himself into the 30-foot deep crevasse where the Ark lay buried under ice. To various experts. What Navarra had taken from the glacial vise of Mount Ararat at an elevation of about 14,000 feet was a 5-foot hand-hewn and squared piece of timber. Yes, he had found wood, but was it a piece of the Ark? Ark scholars generally agree that the Great Flood occurred about 5,000 years ago. So if Navarra could test the wood's age and determine that it was in fact 5,000 years old, then he could be sure it was from the Ark. To test the wood, Navarra visited special laboratories in both the United States and Europe. One of the many experiments performed was to date the wood by means of carbon-14 testing. But after a number of carbon-14 tests had been performed, the dates obtained varied from 1,300 to 1,700 years, far short of the 5,000 years which had been so eagerly expected. Carbon-14 is an extremely popular testing procedure. However, its accuracy has come under some criticism recently. Dr. Melvin A. Cook, former professor of metallurgy at the University of Utah and a 1968 Nitro Nobel Gold Medal winner, explains.
As far as this particular wood is concerned, I believe that one would have considerable difficulty in dating it. First, the sample has undergone a lot of different environment, like the mountain is a volcanic mountain. It's been in glacial terrain and subject to ion exchange. It's partially fossilized, which means that it's changing its composition. We know that whenever a sample of this nature is involved in conditions like that, it shows anomalous dating. For instance, mollusk in water, salt water, living mollusk can show dates 3,000 years old, as though it had been dead 3,000 years. Bristlecold pine, subject to environments similar to this in which this wood has been taken, always dates by the radiocarbon method less than it really is. Just contamination of the sample would make it impossible really to date that by the radiocarbon method.
If we can't rely on the accuracy of carbon-14 to test the Ark relic, what kind of test can be used to accurately determine the age of Navarra's sample? Navarra was certainly faced with a problem. He not only needed to know the age of the wood, but other information, such as its geographic origin. Navarra selected a group of prestigious scientific institutions to determine what test should be performed. The group consisted of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, the National Center of Scientific Research in Madrid, the Center of Forestry Research and Analysis in France, the Department of Prehistoric Studies at the University of Bordeaux, and the world-famous Cairo Museum. The scientists chose 4 testing methods which could be easily cross-referenced, methods which had already been used to date such ancient wooden artifacts as King Tut's coffin, Egyptian canoes, and ancient wooden tools. The tests selected were the degree of lignite or coal formation, cell modification, gain in wood density, and the degree of fossilization. What did these impressive scientific centers learn about Fernan Navarro's sample? Well, the gain in wood density and degree of fossilization tests showed the sample to be around 5,000 years old. The other 2 tests produced an age of 4,484 years plus. In other words, the 4 tests agree. The wood is as old as the Ark itself. To find out more, we spoke to Richard Bliss, ad hoc professor for the University of Wisconsin system.
I have in my hand a very unique piece of wood brought down from the mountains of Ararat by Ferdinand Navarra in his search for the Ark. And it comes from a quercus oak tree that was probably 5 feet in diameter and 150 feet high. The interesting thing about this oak is that this is precisely the kind of tree that we would expect growing in the Mesopotamian valley where Noah built his ark. I have here several pieces of wood. This is a piece of yellow pine, which is a fairly soft wood, and this is our white oak or quercus. I want to point some things out. First of all, you can see quite distinctively that the annual rings, the light-colored and the dark-colored rings, tell us something about the growing season. But notice this here, the tight structure of the cell structure of this piece of wood. There's something very interesting about this because the vessels in this wood are almost plugged with a fiber called Tyros fiber that makes this virtually waterproof. This is precisely the kind of thing that Noah would have had to use to build his ark. It is interesting to note that this piece of wood and this piece of wood are identical. And this is the wood that Ferdinand Navarro brought down from the mountains of Ararat.
What do all these tests prove? Well, that the sample is old enough to fit the biblical flood account. That the wood grew exclusively in the area where Noah is believed to have built the ark. And that it was definitely a piece of wood hewn and waterproofed by a man. Now, this is where Fernan Navarro discovered his wood, at slightly under 14,000 feet up the northwest side of Mount Ararat. Although most Ark scholars agreed Navarro had found wood from the Ark in 1955, disagreement arose about the location of the Ark. Based on earlier eyewitness accounts, many people continued to believe that the Ark rested here, above the 15,000-foot level. So Ark scholars theorized that perhaps the Ark had been damaged in an earthquake, broken in 2, with the main part of the Ark continuing to rest here at 15,000 feet, and the broken remains found by Navarro scattered here. But they had to be sure. So the search for Noah's Ark continued. During the late 50s and early 60s, the famous American spy plane, the U-2, was making its worldwide reconnaissance missions for military intelligence. Many of the flights passed over Mount Ararat on their way to Russia, and a number of U-2 pilots reported seeing what looked like a ship locked in the ice below. In 1960, this photograph was taken at Mount Ararat by a NATO survey team. It startled many scientists, for it looked incredibly like a ship. Measurements were taken, maps were drawn, and an expedition set out to find the object. On June 6, 1960, they reached the site, but there was no Ark. The disappointed men left the mountain. The mysterious ship photograph had been a false lead. Then, in 1969, Fernan Navarro decided to climb the mountain again. The famous French explorer who'd startled the world in 1955 by finding wood agreed to join the Scientific Exploration and Archaeological Research Team, known as SEARCH. Navarro wanted to prove that he could lead another expedition back to the same Ark embedded in the glacial ice pack on Ararat. and, hopefully, recover some more wood. After retracing Navarro's steps up the treacherous mountain, the search team struggled to locate wood in the same crevasses where Navarro found his 1955 wood. But the crevasses were not melted as deep as they were in 1955, and no wood was found in them. Then, Navarro decided to probe the bottom of a small pond adjacent to the artifact ice pack. The team's probing poles did not reach to the bottom. Next, Navarro started probing a small runoff stream from the pond. At 11:15 on July 31st, 1969, Navarro and the search team struck pay dirt. 5 pieces of wood resembling planking, with the longest piece nearly 17 inches long. This new additional find confirmed Navarro's discovery, and for many scientists proved conclusively that Noah had indeed stepped forth onto dry land here on Mount Ararat. The 1969 expedition supplied new evidence to support the broken ark theory. After finding the wood by the pond, scientists determined that a part of the ark was caught in a moving ice floe and was continually moving within the glacier. So if the ark was here, on the northwest side of the mountain, and if, during the earthquake and volcanic eruption of 1840, it was broken in half, then approximately half of the ark slid down about 2,000 feet to another ledge, leaving wood planks strewn in its path. The other half, probably the front, remained intact, wedged in the rocks above. This explains why, at times, the ark appears to be protruding from the ice intact. And this explains how Fernand Navarro was able to find wood from the ark here. Since the 1969 search expedition, much more evidence has been found to support this theory. In July 1972, NASA launched the Landsat satellite. Its mission to maintain, inventory, and assess the world's natural resources. But as it circled the Earth at an altitude of 520 miles, it performed an unexpected service. It photographed Noah's Ark. By use of remote sensing, the Landsat satellite transmits data to receiving stations on Earth. The information is stored on videotape, then electronically transferred to film negatives from which photographs can be made. We traveled to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and visited the Eros Data Center, the government facility for handling and storing these photographs. This is the main reproduction center here at Eros. As you can see by the way I'm dressed, conditions within this center must be very carefully controlled as to temperature, humidity, but most particularly dust. They have to be, in order to maintain the integrity and the incredible accuracy of the Landsat imagery. In a few minutes, this machine will produce for us what appears to be a picture, but what is actually built-up imagery of the data sent by the Landsat satellite. With it, we can use our own eyes to try to determine what it is that rests near the top of Mount Ararat. This photograph of New York was taken by the Landsat satellite. But Eros also stores photographs taken from the Skylab Orbital Laboratory and U-2 flights. All 3 are used by scientists to help us better control the use of our natural resources. This is the Landsat satellite photograph of Mount Ararat. It's remarkably detailed, considering it was taken from an altitude of 520 miles. Unfortunately, visual evaluation alone could never tell for sure whether the Ark is on the mountain. The examination of photographs is not the only means of evaluating the information we've received from Landsat satellite. There is also the technique of computerized electronic analysis, as practiced here in this laboratory. Dr. Waltz, nice to see you, sir.
How are you?
Now, what do we have here?
We have an image from the Landsat satellite. This particular image has the Turkish border.
This is the whole Turkish frontier area?
Right. This is an overview of the entire scene.
Now, would it be possible to get this enlarged so that we could get a closer view of Mount Ararat itself?
Yes, we'll magnify this particular area right there. Dale, would you go ahead and punch in the commands?
As new data was fed into the computer, the image was transformed to a close-up of Mount Ararat and the surrounding area. Based on all the eyewitness sightings of the Ark, we knew that this area was most likely the location of the Ark. Dr. Waltz then inserted a cursor in the shape of a rectangle around the suspected area. The computer was then asked to make a 6-time magnification of the area. The blocking effect you see is the result of this magnification. Each block or pixel, also known as picture element, represents 1 acre of territory. Next, we took our cursor, moved it to the electronic window of the suspected area. The cursor was then reduced to the size of a pixel and inserted into one of the blocks. Then, we asked the computer to tell us which pixels have the same spectral data or reflective light patterns as the block now containing the cursor. Those that are the same would turn green. The first picture element tested showed a common reflective pattern, meaning it was similar in most respects to the surrounding area. Next, we moved the cursor to the location described by the eyewitnesses. When the computer was activated, it was the only spot of the mountain to turn green. Now, Doctor, what does this actually tell us?
This is the only pixel or picture element that has that specific reflectivity in this general vicinity.
Then we know from the electronic data analysis that this is the only thing on the entire mountain of Ararat or any of the surrounding territory which has this particular reflective pattern in all 4 bands of the spectrum.
It most likely is.
Let me, in effect, put you on the hook, Doctor. Is it possible that that is Noah's Ark?
Well, I could not discount that possibility.
Yes, the satellite data confirms the possible location of the Ark, but it doesn't prove conclusively that the Ark is there. If we had no further data than the Landsat imagery, we might never be positive. But we do have further data. We have actual photographs. This picture was released in 1974 by Ark scholar Errol Cummings. It shows what looks like the broken part of a ship resting in the bottom of a crevasse. If the broken Ark theory is valid, then this would be the broken half which slipped down the mountain during the 1840 earthquake. But what about the forepart of the ship? Does it truly rest on a ledge about 2,000 feet higher? The answer came in late September of 1974, when an expedition from the Holy Ground Mission in Frankston, Texas, scaled Mount Ararat. Shooting across the Ahora Gorge with a 35mm Minolta camera, they took this picture. It shows what looks like the forepart of a great vessel. The prow can be seen sticking out of the rocks, 2,000 feet above the location of the Errol Cummings photo. When studied under photographic enlargement, the outline of the ship is not only clear, but planking can actually be seen. The planking of Noah's Ark. Yes, it was here, 5,000 years ago on this mountain in eastern Turkey, that Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives landed and unloaded their cargo of animals from an ark that had provided them with safe passage during the Great Flood. The evidence is overwhelming. We have the biblical accounts, historical accounts, the local accounts of the villages around Ararat, the eyewitness sightings, the discoveries of wood by Fernand Navarra, and the scientific tests. We have seen how the scientific community has carefully examined every aspect of the Ark account. The conclusion is that the greatest story in the Bible, Noah and the Ark, is impeccably true. The Ark is here all right, on this mountain. We could send teams of archaeologists up there right now and attempt a major excavation. But that day must wait. The Turkish government has banned all travel and expeditions to this great mountain. Ararat separates Turkey from Russia, and the political implications of foreigners being on the mountain might easily cause a serious international incident. It's sad when you think about it. The politics of nations now stand in the way of the legacy of man. The Ark must remain here, buried beneath a blanket of ice and snow, until the world is at peace. But that day will come, for there is more to this than just the story of a great wooden ship. It is the story of Noah, a man of foresight, a man with the ability to build a great ark and survive the deluge, a man of faith, perhaps more than you or I, who could ignore the ridicule of others and finish a long and difficult task, a man who had the strength to rebuild and begin life anew. This is the lesson of Noah and the Ark. It's a lesson which has been taught throughout the ages. It is the simple lesson of peace. For Noah is our link to the past and our hope for the future.